Wesley's historic questions were about what to teach, how to teach, and what to do. For the next interval of features for the Connectional Table's emerging forum, we will seek to update these questions for our current moment. We will invite energetic conversation that will illumine our identity, which is tied to what and how we teach, our preferred actions, what we do, and our abiding hopes as we envision the future United Methodist Church. Today, I am joined by Bishop Thomas Bickerton, the Bishop of the New York Annual Conference and President-designate of the Council of Bishops. He is also liaison to the Commission on the General Conference. Good morning, Bishop Bickerton.
Hi, Kenitha. It's great to be with you today. Thank you for the invitation.
It's wonderful to be with you. I've got a few questions for you. The first is about General Conference. If the coronavirus pandemic restricts either a large group gathering of 1,500 or more people, or the participation of folks from anywhere across the global connection due to travel restrictions, is it prudent or fair to hold the in-person General Conference as planned in Minneapolis in August, September of 2021?
Well, personally speaking, I don't believe so. My conviction is if there is one person or one delegation who can't fully participate in the discussions that in particular relate to the future of this denomination, then I believe we have a justice issue on our hands related to the fairness of our process as a connectional church. I also have serious questions related to colonialism if we believe that it's prudent for U.S. delegates who will have easier access to travel, vaccines, and safety protocols to gather without the entire United Methodist global family having the same ease of access.
So if it became prudent or more prudent to not do a General Conference at that time, when would be the most opportune time to make that decision about either to do it or not do it, or change the format or cancel the event altogether? And who makes that decision?
Well, I think that's a question that's really out there in the United Methodist airwaves. This is clearly a matter for the Commission on the General Conference to decide. Paragraph 511 of the Book of Discipline is very clear that the Commission selects the site and sets the dates of the General Conference, and they can do that up to 4 quadrennium in advance by Book of Discipline. You know, while I understand the anxiety that many people have about whether or not the General Conference can even think about having an in-person General Conference in Minneapolis next August and September, having served on the Commission this past quadrennium, I understand the complexities related to contractual agreements, financial obligations, visa acquisitions, etc. And as liaison with the Council of Bishops and the Commission, I've urged the Commission to be aggressive and intentional about the work that will be needed to consider whether or not a virtual General Conference can happen and what business can reasonably be considered if it has to be in a virtual format. And I think the discernment around those decisions really falls into several distinct categories. First, can we reasonably consider having an in-person meeting? I think the final decision on that should happen absolutely no later than early into next year. That will give us as a commission an opportunity to see what happens with the US elections, how the second wave of the virus is being managed, what the status of a vaccine is, what plan is being considered for global distribution of a vaccine. The second piece of discernment is, can we reasonably consider a virtual General Conference? And I believe that's the right way to phrase it. Can we reasonably consider that as an option? You know, given the remote locations of many of our global conferences, can we reasonably expect internet access, bandwidth, technology, translation? Those are just a few of the issues. Can we expect them to be equally and fairly available? If that can be worked out to everybody's satisfaction, Then the question is, what essential business can reasonably be considered in that platform? To what extent can we, either in a plenary or a legislative committee, have fair, balanced, coherent, and meaningful conversations around the future of the church, the budget of the church, the election of a judicial council? And then the third piece is, what's the impact if there's another postponement? How does that affect things like the jurisdictional and central conference meetings that are dependent upon a general conference to determine the number of bishops that the jurisdiction and central conferences are eligible to elect? The retirement of bishops, that can only happen at a regularly scheduled session of the jurisdictional or central conference. Episcopal coverage of areas once retired bishops retire. Elections of judicial council members and membership of certain lay clergy and bishops on general agencies, commissions, and committees that are completely dependent on the general conference. Not to mention a budget for the next quadrennium, which that's an issue too.
Now, as we are talking about this idea of what might happen with General Conference, can you give us some ideas of real world, on the ground implications for local churches, for annual conferences, for central conferences, and for the general church if there is another delay? What's the real
delay has
rubber meets the
precipitated
road implications?
Real world implications, as you say. Some real-time creative conversations that's led to certain actions that have, for example, highlighted regionalism. That's something we've talked about the General Conference doing. Well, it's happening in real time. Or we've had conversations that have emphasized local mission. And local mission has seen a real uptick, which has been a real need in the midst of the pandemic. I think we as a church have become reliant or dependent, if you will, on certain ministry decisions being made by a general conference, which we all know has a decades-long history of dysfunction and inability to make decisions that bless the whole of the denomination. General conference has become a partisan battle on that level that I think looks more like Washington than it does the Church of Jesus Christ. But in the void, as you say, on the ground, in real time, real world implications, local and regional ministry is carried on. And I like to think that if there's a further delay, it's going to carry on. I like to think as well that if there is a further delay, we might find a way to engage certain decisions that will help the dust settle so that we can get back to mission and ministry in one sense and help people live out their convictions in another. We all know that real world implications related to the pandemic means that we'll never be able to be what we once were. And frankly, for an old denomination, some of that stuff is going to be hard to let go of. But I like to think that others will be welcome. I mean, will we at some point say something like, do you remember those days when we used to gather large groups of people in one setting for worship? That may be a possibility. I look forward to the day when we can say, thank God above, that we were once and for all able to deal with the sin of racism in a real and responsible manner. Some things are going to be hard to let go of, but some things should be let go of, and I think those things are playing out in real time. Now, your question's a long one, and I guess my answer is a long one too, but you look at things that are happening right now. Our general agencies, for example, are changing in real time. They're dealing with declining resources. That's inserted a dose of reality into their work, and I applaud our general agencies for not waiting until changes are imposed upon them to deal with things like reduced staff, elimination of budgets, reprioritization of essential ministries. I think it's great, but I do have worries. I'm currently the president of UMCOR, and I personally worry about donor fatigue because of natural disasters and issues of global health that just are not going to fade. Our need to be connectional and supportive of those who need the church's collective resources is a hallmark of who we've been, and I hope always will be. There's some things that I hope don't go away. On a jurisdictional level, I personally hope that the jurisdictional conferences will take advantage of this season in our life by not electing the same number of bishops that we currently have. I mean, we're going to be smaller as a denomination, and we need to spend some time seeing how the dust is going to settle financially, numerically, and missionally before we determine how many bishops and Episcopal areas we need in order to fulfill our mission and ministry in the church. And then finally, I'd say this real-time implication has directly affected our local churches, and I personally believe that some of them are not going to make it once this fades. We have for a long time, Kenitha, propped up a system, a posture, and a number of our franchises that's now going to change. And we need to think seriously about our strategic presence in places where Methodism may not survive the changes that we're facing. But that should give us a great opportunity to find freshness in our passion to make disciples. So while the real-time changes are tough, I look upon them pretty positively in terms of how God might be at work in our midst.
Is our polity keeping us from moving into this future, or are there ways in which we need to think about our polity differently, perhaps?
Well, I think the quick answer is yes. Does it hold us back? Yes. Does it need to be looked at? Yes. But I think one of the things we have to realize, Kenitha, is that we didn't create a complex and in places a very dysfunctional book of discipline overnight. It's been created over the course of our history. And the reality is, because we didn't create it overnight, we won't recreate it overnight either. But there are some things that are just going to demand our presence. I mean, when you talk about complex matters that you need to discuss for the future of the church, you've got to be in relationship with one another. You got to be present in order to listen, present in order to strategize, present in order to celebrate, present in order to grieve. I think about that moment at the special session of General Conference in 2019, when there was a flood of people who came forward in mass, and the bishops met them there at the stage for prayer and response. You can't do that on a Zoom call. And while technology is great, you just can't substitute the real human need to be with one another in joy and in sorrow, in celebration and in grief. And, the reality of it is, while we want to move forward, our book of discipline does hold us back. And we've got to find ways together to recreate that so that it becomes relevant and meaningful in a rapidly changing context. So we've got some major challenges in that regard.
You are also the bishop of an annual conference, in addition to your general church role with the Council of Bishops, the Commission, etc. So talk to me a little bit about that idea of needing to be present with one another from the perspective of the leader of an Episcopal area of an annual conference.
Well, a couple years ago, I wrote a book entitled, "What Are We Fighting For?" It was a book that called us to look at the things that matter the most. What matters most? COVID-19 has had no respect for borders or political parties or theological differences. When COVID-19 hit in New York, we distributed PPE equipment to every one of our local churches. We gave a pension and healthcare payment waiver to every local church. We established standardized reopening guidelines for every setting. In the midst of lives that were in the balance, we put aside our differences, focused on ministry, and determined very quickly what mattered most. Right now, we're engaged in very substantive conversations about how we create an anti-racist annual conference. And from a contextual standpoint, it's a multi-tiered approach that's going to have to look at where people are and where we long for them to be. I just long for a day when we will plan and organize our work on the mission field and not on the preservation of our pews. We've got to get relevant again. I long for a day when we deeply respect our diversity and celebrate it, rather than always seeking a uniformity of thought and expression. I long for a day when we can join hearts and hands in creating an anti-racist denomination and a place where gender inequality is never acceptable. What we're trying to do here in New York is to plan our work around integrating our theology with our practice and focusing on a revival of evangelism that really believes that following Jesus Christ really does change and transform a life. I mean, let's weave justice and discipleship into the same sentence and find a way to genuinely turn this thing over to God and guide us instead of relying on our own frail solutions. I've been involved in this United Methodist thing, Kenitha, since I was 3 days old. I've been living with a calling to serve in this system for 47 years. I've seen it work. I've seen it work beautifully. There's no reason to think that it can't become that way again. But in the midst of all that we're facing, I think ministry's been driven down into a local level where we're having to really examine who's going to make it and who's not. And the ones that are going to make it, how are we going to resource them? And with that resourcing, how are we going to get back to the business of making disciples? So the doors are opened for us with great possibility. And I think it does relate to all of us in very real and practical ways in the local settings where we're living out our calling.
Bishop, this has been a wonderful conversation about not just the General Conference, but about the future of the church. Is there anything that I haven't asked that you want to say?
Wow. I guess the final thing I'd say to you is that I really believe, Kenitha, that there's power in this connection. We are stronger together than we are apart. And that's a cliche, but it's true. It's why, for example, on an annual conference level, you have things like equitable compensation. In strategic places that can't pay a salary, the connection comes along and makes the investment. It's why on a spiritual level, you have things like intercessory prayer. In times when somebody can't pray, there's someone praying for them. It's why on a denominational level, you have UMCOR. When a hurricane blows away everything you have, there's a hand, a heart, and a resource that'll help you get back on your feet. From a polity standpoint, we've proven to ourselves that this denomination can function in the vacuum. We rise up and do what needs to be done when it needs to be done. So you extend a quadrennium, you rely on existing personnel for a while longer, you use technology and creativity, and you keep it going. But our weakness has been revealed. Our polity isn't nimble, it's not pliable in places, it wasn't created for a crisis, it wasn't tailored for an emergency, it's got serious flaws. But when that flaw happens, you just can't force something into it. You have to let it emerge. And we have to find a way to allow ourselves to be comfortable with the unpredictable and realize that God will and God can and God does use us to reveal a possibility that we could have never seen without it. I think we've got to find ways to be more nimble again. And we've got to find ways to do ministry in spite of the obstacles that are in front of us. I just believe in us enough to know that we will, by faith, be able to do that.
Thank you, Bishop Bickerton. That is an inspiring way to end our conversation today and really places before us the great hope of the church. Thank you.